I wanted to re-show you this for the purpose of kind of mentally prepping you as to where we're going. So if you look at the outline here, we've spent time. I don't have a laser tonight. All right. Anyway, we've spent time discussing chapters 1 through 7 and seeing the ritual sacrifices. We've gone through the ordination of the priesthood, and we've kind of already talked about and studied the ideas of what ritual purity looked like, what animals you weren't supposed to eat, what animals made you unclean, what activities made you unclean. Even if they were God-given or God-prescribed, they could make you unclean. And so that all led us to the Day of Atonement, and now we're going away from the Day of Atonement, but we're going to follow this same pattern. So while, for instance, we don't cover the ritual purity, we're going to start seeing how God called his people to have moral purity. And that's why these next chapters are so exciting, because they are full of things that God has still called his people to do today. Now, the caveat, though, is that there are some things that we will find in the old law that aren't applicable today. And just the general rule that I want us to kind of be having in our thoughts and in our minds and in our understanding is, as far as I'm going to teach it, if God repeated or re-emphasized a portion of that law, for instance, like what is allowed in an intimate relationship between male and female in the New Testament, then we know that that applies. And God does that. He re-emphasizes some of these laws in the New Testament. Now, there are some things that he doesn't re-emphasize in the New Testament that I believe, through combining the practical application of Scriptures, God is not binding us towards. We have liberty and freedom to be outside of those things. And I was just kind of asking myself, why is that the case? For instance, in the section for tonight, in chapters 18 and 19, you're going to see some language that says, like, God wants clear distinction. He doesn't want you to mix different kinds of seeds or different kinds of clothing material. He wants uniqueness and one-of-a-kindness. And out of everything I've been able to compile, the ultimate reason that God might have prescribed that to his people is because there was so much pagan crossover. And you see that pattern in that language throughout these next two chapters that we're going to look at tonight. God is going to call his people to be different and set apart and to have a different standard than their pagan neighbors, with the goal that they will spread this holiness to them. So, That's kind of my caveat as we get into some of these things. And hopefully that helps answer some questions that might arise in the text as we work through it. If you were able to kind of quickly look at the study guide, the first question I asked is, what phrase is repeated 6 times in this chapter? And this is a carryover from Sunday. We kind of touched on this based off our brother Michael's comment. But what's the phrase? I am the Lord, or I am the Lord your God. And chapter 19, it follows a very similar pattern. And if you kind of are able to prescribe it, I didn't do that for this class, and maybe this is something you can do. There's even an order that is throughout chapter 19 when God says, I am the Lord your God, or I am the Lord. And you can follow that pattern. But the question is, what's the point of that phrase? What does it matter that God emphasizes that he is the Lord your God? Yeah, Shad?
Idolatry was a big thing back then, and they tended to struggle with that. So the fact that he's emphasizing that he is the Lord is showing that there's no other gods before him.
Okay, so I'm God, I'm the Lord. We have an allusion that Shad made back to the 10 Commandments, that you shall not have other gods before me. You're not going to practice idolatry. You're not going to make graven images. Perhaps that's part of the reason that God reemphasizes, hey, it's just me. I am the Lord your God. There's no one else. Any other thoughts or ideas on why God might emphasize so much? And again, depending on your translation, that phrase, I am the Lord your God, is going to appear 50 times all the way through chapter, I think it's 20 or 22, but it's going to appear 50 times, so it's pretty significant.
He's telling them things to do, like, you shall keep my commandments, you shall keep my statutes and my judgments.
God is trying to establish his argument when he gives commands, and we're going to see in chapter 19 kind of what the foundation of those commands are. Why is God saying what he's saying as far as like what he's commanding his people to do? But he's setting up the argument by saying, look, I'm the creator, you're the creation. I get to dictate what you're doing. I'm the one that's come into your presence, and I'm the one that's placed myself in the center of you, and you're the one that's trying to come to me. And I've invited you to come to me, but you're going to come to me in the way that I've asked you to come to me. Even in voluntary sacrifices that we've looked at and votive offerings, you have to give those in the way that God prescribed. It's not a free-for-all. There's an appropriate way to come before God and come before him in worship and in sacrifices. But he's trying to make a point to them. I get to set the rules. And I chose the New International Version translation for this, not because it's the best translation. I think it really emphasizes what this verse is saying here, which is the center point that we belong to God. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? So again, God's presence is supposed to be dwelling in his people, and people who have invited Christ into their lives, people who have put on Christ in baptism, people who have crucified the old man, buried him, and been resurrected to newness of life. So your bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Again, reestablishing this idea that is so necessary for us to see that God gets to dictate what happens. And when you see what God is going to call us to do, and we've already kind of seen this, for instance, in chapter 15, because they're mirror chapters, God is allowed to control and say and set the precedence for what happens even in my day-to-day life. And so this phrase is going to re-emphasize that point. Aaron or Sierra, did y'all have questions, comments? Okay, all right. Any other thoughts or ideas on why God is repeating this? All right, moving on. So, how can we apply verses 3 and 4 of chapter 18 to holiness, or to the concept of holiness? And I asked you to read 1 Peter chapter 1. So 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 16. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lust which was yours in ignorance, but like the Holy One who has called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Isaac, will you please read verses 3 and 4 of Leviticus 18 for us?
You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you live, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God.
So there's this concept in verses 3 and 4 that verse 4 says live. Some translations also say walk, and that's the same word that was emphasized in verse 3. God is concerned with your walk. He's concerned with your life, how you're going to live these things out. So therefore, when we get to verses 3 and 4, what's the application? Or what's the comparison that we can make to 1 Peter? Okay.
Did things in Canaan. There is almost the precedent that's been set that how man has chosen to do it, how man is doing it, has no part with the holiness that God commands. So it's almost like it's just establishing a difference between man versus God, especially when you get into the passage in 1 Peter.
So our brother Joel is commenting on this idea that there's a difference between the way man has chosen to do things, or the way man has chosen to run his life and to dictate his life, versus how God is going to call us to live. I think there's validity to that statement. And to kind of piggyback or to elaborate a little bit further, one of the points that jumps out to me in these verses is you might have been used to serving God that way. That might have been habitual for you. Maybe that's what you're used to. That was common, and you just did that in your day-to-day life. And some of you understand that language. Some of you grew up not practicing this kind of worship. Some of you grew up practicing worship in a very different way. Some of you, maybe here tonight, are still in that mindset where you just see the habits that were formed from your upbringing and your childhood and the way your parents chose to do things. And there's nothing wrong with the habits that you once had in terms of them being just evil in and of themselves. But you start running into issues when you kind of just default and say, well, that's the way I've always done it. That's the way that I was raised, or that's the way that I was brought up. And especially when you start saying, well, God, like, I get what you're saying, but I think I can do things this way or in this order. And it goes back to the key concept that we see repeated in just the first 5 verses. I am the Lord your God. I get to set the order, not you, not your family, not your heritage, not your tradition, not what was common to you in your past life. Yes, Michael.
And unfortunately, I think this sometimes translates into even our worship to God. I mean,
Amen.
we hear about obedience to God's commandments, and some of these commandments aren't necessarily worship. But I think it does sometimes translate to our worship. You know, God has laid out what He wants. If we want to be pleasing to Him, we're going to do what He wants. That really doesn't have anything to do with what I think or what I want or what is encouraging to me. When it comes to worshiping God, He's prescribed what we're supposed to do. And especially during this time period, it was even more important to be very particular. I mean, just the last few chapters, we've gone over that, right? Very particular about how we approach Him and how we worship Him. I don't think it's any different today. We may not have the immediate result of disobedience that some of them did. I don't think He's changed about what He wants, who He is, and what He expects of us.
God, as we've studied Leviticus, and the word that our brother used was particular. So he's very particular. He's very instructive as to what he expects. And there were severe consequences. We spent chapter 10 talking about that. Chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement, God reminds Aaron, hey, your sons just died. And so obviously what you're about to do has real consequences, immediate consequences. You see some of that in the New Testament as well. Ananias and Sapphira lying to God and having immediate consequences brought upon them for disobeying God. And while we might not drop dead for disobeying God or disregarding God's instruction today, the consequences are still there, even if they're not immediate. But it's just important to see how God is setting up his argument in these first 5 verses. So as we get into verse 6 and on, and we're not going to get into some of these nuances here, but verse 6, none of you shall approach any blood relative of his to uncovered nakedness. I am the Lord your God. God can set boundaries on the relationships and the kinds of relationships that you get to have because he is the Lord your God. He is the creator. And so you see from verses 6 all the way down through verse 18 verse 23, that God is specific as far as setting those boundaries. Again, verse 21, I am the Lord your God. What's the point of this? Why is God setting this up? Because of, for instance, like verse 20, you will be defiled. That idea of being defiled is the idea of being unclean. And as we've studied the idea of holiness versus uncleanliness, purity versus uncleanliness, clean versus unclean, in our class, you don't want to be defiled or unclean because that removes you from the presence of God's people at times or the presence of God himself. So God is allowed to dictate those things, and then he repeats it again in verse 24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things. So God is trying to set a different standard for his people. Why? Verse 26, but as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. Verse 28, so that the land will not spew you out, should you defile it, as it has spewed out the nation which has been before you. These people are called to make a difference, and this leads us to question number 3, and we're going to come back to answer this question at the end of class. So at this point, I want you to see how the end of chapter 18 ties into the application of 2 Timothy 3 and Leviticus 19. But God is calling his people to not be like those around them, to not defile themselves and to defile the land in turn, but to maintain this standard of holiness and purity. Questions or comments through chapter 18? Yeah, Joseph?
Ask this question. Leviticus 18:25, where it talks about if people are in sin and living corruptly.
Okay.
The culture that the land vomits them out.
Yeah.
Is that applicational for us in this day and age as well, or is it just an Old Testament example of a nation living in sin and being vomited out?
Well, specifically, he's talking about the land of Canaan here and the inhabitants of Canaan, and they've defiled the land, or they've lived in a state of uncleanliness. Therefore, God is spewing them, vomiting, driving them out. Now, that's what that verse is talking about. The inhabitants of Canaan were spewed or driven or vomited out of the land because of their uncleanliness. God's holiness is going to come into the land and drive those things out. He's warning his people, and we're going to see this warning again. Don't be like that. Don't be like them, because you too will be spewed and vomited out. Don't expect a different result. If one person ate the bad chicken and started throwing up, don't think that you are going to escape the same consequences. Now, the second half of your question, is that applicable to us today? Well, I would say our God is an unchanging God. God is not pleased with sin. He is not rejoicing in sin and finds sin to be an abomination. And there are consequences that happen for sin. God is aware of the rise and the fall of nations. God is in control of the rise and the fall of nations. Now, sometimes we're left like Habakkuk, questioning God. Why are you allowing this evil to happen? Why is corruption all around me? Why aren't you doing anything, God? And God would, I'd imagine, answer us the same way he answered Habakkuk and say, I'm doing something in your day that you can't even imagine. So how God works and what his timing is in those things, I don't know, and I can't really comment on, but I would imagine that God is still very much concerned with sin and how it's affecting others and what our role is in dealing with that sin that he invites us to share in. So that wasn't a great answer, I know, but that's how I'm going to answer it. So other questions or comments? Yes, Michael. Yeah, yeah. So unfortunately, Satan, I understand the Bible describes him as crafty, but he's not very unique or clever in the way he's caused God's people to fall to temptation. They're all typically the same kinds of temptation, whether they be lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life, selfishness that causes us to fall. Those categories have done God's people in forever. The call, though, is to do what you said in between your comment there, to live as those sojourners and exiles in the land. 1 Peter, the entire book of 1 Peter, is an appeal to be just that. If you take time to study 1 Peter, you see that he is saying you are sojourners and aliens. The way we express it is you're in the world, but you're not of the world. I think a better way to express that is have you ever been around someone who speaks English, but you know they're not from the United States because they don't really understand the culture? They don't really understand our idiomatic expressions and our way of just speaking. They say things kind of like funny, and you're like, well, like, I guess you're kind of American, but you're not really an American. That's God's point in 1 Peter. You're in this world, but you shouldn't sound like the world. You shouldn't be mistaken as one of the world. People should look at you and be like, man, like, you're not really from here, are you? Like, you're kind of a foreigner. And that's what God is expecting his people to live out in the New Testament, according to 1 Peter. But that's what God expected his people to do all the way back in the book of Leviticus and re-emphasized even stronger in Deuteronomy. So, questions or comments? Yes,
And going
Megan.
along with that, I just like the comparison between, because God is talking about all these like moral and immoral things, the comparison between God and the gods of the other time, like from Egypt and from Canaan or from Greece or whatever. Those gods did these immoral things that he's talking about
Yeah.
here, but God himself is pure, so we're not supposed to do them. We're supposed to be like God and not like the gods of other cultures.
And we don't accept or participate in anything that would even remotely look like the pagan worship. And that's why this distinction in chapters 18 and 19, and 19 specifically too, is so important. God is setting his people apart to where nothing that they can do could be mistaken for pagan worship, because it would have been acceptable and honored in worshiping of pagan gods or pagan religion. Other questions or comments? Great point, Megan. Anybody else? So, we're going to move on from that question because we're going to come back to it. What would be the benefit in reproving my neighbor according to verse 17 of chapter 19? This is something I thought was really unique. So, verse 17, you shall not hate your fellow countrymen, your fellow brothers, some translations say, in your heart. That phrase, in your heart, is a really neat phrase to study. If you take time to study in your heart, the Bible makes it very clear that there are certain things I can say and do in my heart that I'll never project. They'll never come out of me, but I've said them in my heart. And that's a really fun study if you're looking for a phrase to study. But here, you're not outwardly disgruntled with your neighbor, but you're internally disgruntled with them. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. So, why would I ever want to go and reprove my neighbor when he's done something that hasn't sat well with me? Yeah, Jacob.
Well, if there's something, in the air between you, if there's, something that you're feeling upset about that maybe they don't know about, it's going to be hard to ever have a relationship with that person, that activity's standing between you. So you need to bring that up.
So if I don't vocalize the riff or the barrier that's between us, it's going to be hard to have a relationship. Why? So that's true. That's a true statement. Yeah. But why? Like, think about it. Aaron, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to just say that the reason you need to fix that situation so you don't sin. So he says, so you shall not incur sin because of him. I think that kind of goes exactly what he's saying, because you have, otherwise you're gonna have ill feelings towards that person. You may not project them, but there's gonna be a rift in that relationship, and that's probably why that's that what he's saying, that the relationship's gonna be different. Even if you never say anything, there's gonna be some type of a barrier there, and so you need to fix that situation. You need to love your brother. You need to not harbor that hate in your heart.
Let me ask you this. Think about someone who does something that has annoyed you. Like the way they talk, maybe, the things that they say, maybe it's a behavior they do, and it just like annoys you, and it kind of just like keeps rubbing you the wrong way. It started off as annoyance, but then you started kind of getting angry about it, right? Just you would look at them and be like, man, I can't believe they're doing that. Have you seen and now you start getting internally and maybe slightly externally angry with that person, right? You've not brought it up to them, and then that has already started to seep out of you because it's internal. And then it starts getting shared. Like, man, can you believe that she's like that? She always, right? That's what we like to say. Like they never. And now you're in sin, right? Now you've taken something that was a grievance at one point, just internally, that you never vocalized, and now you've made it, and you've birthed sin, and you've birthed death into the world. It's not an uncommon occurrence. It happens in marriages. It happens with my kids. Like, I don't correct something that is an annoyance to me, and then I end up being unrighteously angry at my children. It happens in friendships. It happens in the church. The problem is that because I didn't just do what Leviticus instructed me to do in verse 17 and bring it up to my neighbor and just allow them to maybe explain themselves, I've judged and condemned them in my heart and in my life, and therefore I can never apply verse 18, which verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And that language starts sounding really New Testament-y, right? This idea of loving your neighbor. All right, but Jesus, who's my neighbor? I'm called to love my brother, but like really, like who's my brother, Jesus? And to that, we hopefully have our wheels turning where we start thinking of the fulfillment of the laws and the prophets being loving God and serving others. We start thinking of passages like Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 5 that say to consider everyone more important than ourselves, because that's what Jesus did. We start thinking about passages that Jesus talked about in loving our enemies. And the ones that I put up on the screen, because love is found all in 1 John 4, and I know y'all have studied this with Brother Owen. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. So this knowledge that I have of God in Leviticus ought to cause me to love my neighbor, to love him as a fellow brother. Same concept in the New Testament. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. We love because he first loved us. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And this is the commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. Take that and let's look back at chapter 19, the first few verses. Speak to all the congregations, verse 2 of chapter 19, the sons of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. There's the invitation. Be holy like God is. Every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Why do I have to honor my mother and father? Why do I have to respect my mom and dad? If I can't respect my mom and dad who I see, I can't respect God who I don't see. If I don't learn to submit to the authority that God has put in my life, in simple instruction of parents, man, it's going to be really hard to say, all right, God, I've never seen you. I've never heard your voice speak to me. But somehow I'm supposed to be like, yes, Lord, whatever you say. You're the Lord my God. There's so much application drawn from that phrase, I am the Lord your God, that is carried over into the New Testament. Do not turn to idols or make for yourself molten gods. I am the Lord your God. It shall be, verse 5, when you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that it may be accepted. This is really cool. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, and the next day. But what remains until the third day shall be burned with fire. Think about that. You make a peace offering. You're supposed to eat it the first or second day. And say there was a really large peace offering that you brought before God. And there was so much that you couldn't eat it. And you're like, man, it's coming to day 2. We didn't really attack that peace offering on day 1 like I thought we would. So what are you going to do on day 2? Because you know you and your family can't eat it. Like, think about that. What are you going to do? You're going to invite someone else over, right? Hey, brother, come and bring your family and let's share in this peace offering, because we need to celebrate the fact that you and I are in peace with God, and it encourages this fellowship, this thinking of my brother. The next few verses, just because it's my property and it's my farm and it's my harvest, I don't get to take every single ounce. 100% profit is not for me. I consider others. I consider my brother. I consider the poor. I consider the sojourner. Because as we've already established, sometimes the poor aren't going to have enough to offer to God, but they get to come into my field, take that flour or take that grain, make it into flour, and then offer a cup of flour to God for the forgiveness of their sins. God is trying to get us to understand what it means to love Him. And it's to love others, and to think of others, and to consider others, and to not take advantage of the helpless. To not think that all this is about me and mine, but to be selfless, like God is selfless. But I say to you, this is from the ERV, the easy to read version, just so we all understand it. But I say to you people who are listening to me, Jesus speaking, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, ask God to bless the people who ask for bad things to happen to you. Pray for the people who are mean to you. I'm telling you to love your enemies and do good to them. Lend to people without expecting to get anything back. If you do this, you will have a great reward. What's the reward in Leviticus? For considering others. You get to be holy like God is holy. And you understand what God is saying when He says, I am the Lord your God. You can keep reading the rest of the verse. Hopefully the application is pretty evident. And I want to finish this point in this question. Question number 3. How does 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5 apply to Leviticus 19? But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. Chapter 19, this is the point of chapter 19. It's a call to holiness. God's character being holy, being pure, being unique and one of a kind, God's character is the basis for all these commandments. Because God is holy, He says, this is what I want you to do. I am the Lord your God. God doesn't just make flippant or arbitrary rules. That's something that I struggle with. Sometimes I get so annoyed with what my kids are doing that I say things that I make a rule in the house right then and there, and Chelsea goes, so you're going to make sure that happens, right? Like, you're going to make sure that they don't do that? And I'm like, man, that's not God. That's not what God is like. God wasn't just one day annoyed with humanity and says, you know what? I don't want them to have all the harvest. God wasn't annoyed with humanity and says, you know what? I don't think that they should be sleeping with their family members. God thought about this and took time to think about how can my character affect these people, my creation's daily lives? How can they come to be holy as I am holy? Now, the question for us to think about and consider is, do you actually think that you can do that? Or do you think that God called you to a standard that is something you can never attain, that is unattainable? So God asks us to mirror his character, to follow these commands, and that these commands involve my lifestyle, my walk, my day-to-day living. And that passage, that idea, is seen in multiple times in the New Testament. I took this one from 1 Thessalonians 2, but it is also repeated in Colossians and Ephesians. Walk in a manner worthy of the God who has called you into his own kingdom and glory. Colossians and Ephesians say, walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called. God invites you, he invites me to be holy as he is holy. And he says, this is how you do it. You recognize I'm the Lord your God, and I set out the commandments. That's our application. That's our lesson. There is so much more in chapter 19. Like, my Bible is littered with notes and applications. I hope you'll take time to go back and look through these things. Any final questions or comments tonight? All right, if not, thank you for your attention and participation. We are dismissed at this time and be looking.